2 feet upon the land and flippers in the sea. A seal, yet a human, is the beautiful Selkie. If you see one coming, good fortune follows thee. Never make a promise to a beautiful Selkie. The story that I'm going to tell you was collected by Duncan Williamson, and it's of a family who lived on the west side of Scotland about 200 years ago, and they were a crofter family, so they had some sheep and they had some goats and chickens and ducks, and their mother, Madeline, took care of the animals, and Dougal went out on his little boat and he would catch fish, and he would bring them home, and for dinner they would eat whatever he caught. And they had 2 children, twins, and they looked just the same with a little turned up nose and freckles spattering their faces, except that Mary had great big eyes, the color of the sky, when it was overcast. And her brother Malcolm, she was the older sister, he was younger by at least 5 minutes, and Malcolm had these great big brown eyes that looked like melted chocolate. And the 2 children loved each other deeply, and they played together and they were helpful, and their favorite thing though, their cottage was overlooking the ocean. And there was a little path that went down to the sand. And so they would go to the sand, and Mary would take her heart because she loved to play. And her brother Malcolm loved to swim. So they would go down and they would walk a ways, and there was this pretty far down, there was a rock pile. And so they would go and they would sit, and Mary would start to play. Then the seals would come out because the seals loved the sound of the music. And this was what Malcolm was waiting for. He would jump into the water and he would swim with them, and he would swim for hours. And Mary would call down to him, "If you stay there much longer, you're going to turn into a seal yourself." And he said, "Mary, can you imagine anything better? I would love it. It would be the pinnacle. So they would swim and they would go back to their little house. And as they got older, Mary started to help her mother out with the animals, and Malcolm would go out fishing with his father. And one night, it was a beautiful night, the moon was out and it illuminated the entire countryside. And Dougal called Malcolm to him and he said, "Son, it's such a beautiful night, let's go fishing. I'm feeling really good about this." And so Mary gathered a basket, and it had the lines and the hooks, and she gave it to them and walked them down to the shore as they pushed off their little boat and waved goodbye. And Malcolm was rowing, and they came to a spot, and Dougal said, "This is it, let's stop here." And so they got their hand lines and had it over the side, and were waiting and waiting. Nothing was biting. So they pulled them in, and Dougal said, "Just a little bit further." So they rowed out, and they rowed out. And then he saw some kelp putties, and he knew the cod must be here. So they stopped and they dropped their lines, and sure enough, as soon as it hit the water, they were bit. And they pulled on the fish, and every time, immediately, they were bit until they had this mound of silver fish on the boat. And Dougal said, "Let's not stop. Let's collect them. We can dry them, save them for winter." So they kept fishing, and all of a sudden, Dougal felt this very cold wind across his cheek. And he looked up just in time to see a flash of lightning. And so he said, they gathered their lines up really quick, and he said, "It's time, let's go." Because as a fisherman, you know that you need to be very conscious of the weather. So they started rowing, and the rain started coming down. And they started rowing, and the wind was swirling around them, and the waves were coming up. And Dougal knew that Malcolm was a strong swimmer, so he said, "If anything happens, just leave the fish, leave everything, and swim to the shore." And sure enough, just as he said it, this torrential downpour drenched the boat, and a huge wave came, and it crashed over the boat, and it was capsized. And so Dougal did all he could to get up above the water and swim to the shore. And he finally got there, and he stepped his foot on the shore, and Mary was there, and her mother. And Mary turned to him and said, "But Papa, where's Malcolm?" Because Malcolm hadn't come to the shore. And so they called out his name, they called, and it was lost in the howl of the wind. And Mary's mother was worried for her and said, "Come on, Major, we need to go." And Mary refused. She had the tears streaming down her face, and she was calling out Malcolm's name all night. The next morning dawned, and it was clear, and the little boat had washed up on the shore, and so they took it out, and again they called for Malcolm, and there was nothing. And the village by this time had heard about it, and so they brought their boats, and everyone was searching for him for a week. It went on 2 weeks, and they started to give up hope because they had not found his body. And Mary was kind of a changed girl at that point. She kind of withdrew into herself, and she didn't talk to them much. She didn't go into town anymore. She just kind of walked along the beach, and she played her music, and she watched. Parents saw it happen, and they had already lost their son, and they saw this happening to their daughter, and their hearts were broken, and they started fighting. And at night Mary would hear them, and still she would just get up and walk the beach. And one day she did, and she saw in front of her that there were these little flipper marks as if a seal had come out on the beach. And she looked at them, and they changed to footprints, and the footprints led around the side to a sea cave. And something told her that she should go in there. So she walked inside, and her eyes kind of adjusted to the light, and there was someone coming toward her, and she saw that it was her brother Malcolm. And she yelled in joy, and she wrapped her arms around him and said, "Malcolm, you're here." And he said, "Oh, Mary, I've missed you so much." And she said, "But you've broken our heart. We were heartbroken. Why didn't you tell us that you were alive?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to, but I couldn't. You see, the night of the storm, I felt a big wave crash over me, and I was sort of paralyzed. And then an arm wrapped itself around me and took me down to a cave at the bottom of the sea. And Mary, they were the Selkies. They were people, but they were seals, and they could go back and forth, and I wanted nothing more than to join them." And she said, "But Malcolm, will I see you again?" And he said, yes, you can see me many times, but this is the life I have chosen. Do not tell anyone. Don't tell our parents. If I'm worried about the safety for my Selkies, it has to be something that you keep between us." And so she agreed, and she watched as he jumped back into the water and waited a minute until she saw a little brown seal head pop up and wave as it disappeared. And she went back home overjoyed, and her parents saw her, and by this time 2 years had passed, and finally she was back to herself with a joy in her eyes, and she sang, and it was wonderful. She went back into the village, and things were good. And she would still go off on long walks for hours at a time, and they never asked where she went, but when she came back, she would be happy. And they knew whatever she was doing was bringing her joy. And it was seeing her brother. And he told her about his life as a Selkie, and how they would come out of the water and walk amongst people, and no one ever knew, and what they did in the water, and the joy that they had. And her heart was filled up, and she wrote it down in a little red journal that she kept. And time passed, and she had many suitors because she was kind and lovely and beautiful, and she didn't really want anything to do with any of them, but she did have a good friend, a minister who had come to town. He was about 10 years younger, and they would talk, and they grew very close. And time passed, and her parents passed, and so she took over the animals, and she did the fishing, and then time passes as it does, and Malcolm had gone to the cave to meet his sister, and she hadn't come. And another day passed, and 3 days, and he began to get worried. So he came, assuming the form of a man, and he walked to the cottage, his home, that he hadn't been in over 40 years. And he knocked on the door, and there was no answer. And so he opened the door and he called out, "Mary." And she said, "Yes, who is it?" He said, "It's Malcolm." She said, "Come in." So he went to where she was lying down in the room, and she was very pale and she was kind of gaunt. And he said, "Mary, are you okay?" And she said, "Malcolm, this may be the last time that I see you, brother. I'm not doing very well." And he said, No, we will solve this. Mary, come with me. Come with me and join me in the Selkies. Your body will be healed and strong and new." And she just shook her head and said, My place is here, brother. My place is here. But I do have a favor that I would ask you. And he said, "Anything, dear heart, what can I do?" And she gave him the little red journal. And she said, "I would have that you give this to my friend, the minister Robert. He's been very dear to me and I want him to understand." And Malcolm agreed. And so he went to the church and he knocked on the door. And the minister opened and he saw Malcolm's webbed hand as he handed him the little red journal, and he took it. And Malcolm said, "This is from my sister Mary. She wanted you to have it," and he left. And the minister read that book many, many times. And he never told a soul, except finally, as time went by, he had to, and he told 2 of the villagers the story of Malcolm and Mary. And they in turn told their children and their grandchildren, which is how I come to tell it to you today, the story of the Selkie brother.